But we are going to continue with our Hurricane Helene coverage. Of course, this week marks 1 year since the hurricane swept over western North Carolina, and that is where we find our chief meteorologist, Brad Panovich, in Fleetwood, which is in Ashe County. Now, Brad, thank you so much for joining us. I know you've been tracking the long-term impacts of Hurricane Helene for a while, and you brought in an expert to help further break that down.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. We're back in Fleetwood. I was in this exact location roughly about a year ago after the storm, and looking at some of the destruction, which you could see behind me, the church still being condemned. It's boarded up right now, and they're actually in the process of eventually moving this. But I wanted to reach out to a hurricane expert, Dr. Rick Knabb, former director of the National Hurricane Center, now our hurricane specialist at the Weather Channel. Dr. Knabb joins us live from Atlanta. Dr. Knabb, thank you so much for joining us.
Brad, thank you so much for what you're doing and the coverage there and showing us what it's like to go through what will be months and years of recovery from such a devastating event.
Yeah. Dr. Deb, let me ask you, like, when you think back to last year, obviously we know the impacts that tropical systems have on the coast. This was another example here in western North Carolina of these inland impacts. And what sticks with you now a year later from Helene and the destruction it caused from Florida all the way up into the Mid-South?
It's about the fact that Helene wasn't just a powerful hurricane, which it was when it hit the coast, but a powerful hurricane is also horizontally large and fast moving in terms of its forward speed. Those are the things that really set Helene apart. And we've known for decades that hurricanes are not just coastal events, and we've learned the hard way in recent years and decades that larger hurricanes, everything else considered equal, are worse than smaller hurricanes if they're at the same intensity hitting the same location, because then you have the conditions occupying a larger area. It's going to rain longer. It's going to be windy for longer. They're going to be a bigger storm surge producer, and they're going to hold more moisture. And the fact that Helene was so large but moving so quickly, it maintained so much of its strength wind-wise and brought so much of its structure still intact into the southern Appalachians.
Yeah, when we look back, that was one of the things that I was struck by. We kind of knew that there was going to be this rain impact, but the wind impacts were pretty dramatic in the southern Appalachians. We saw these massive blowdowns, and I know there's been some recent research about some of these bands of strong winds. They're kind of like horizontal within these tropical systems. What is something about Helene that was different, you think, than other hurricanes?
Well, the number of deaths from the forces of the wind in Georgia and South Carolina and North Carolina, that's the worst wind fatality event that we've had from a tropical system in a long, long time. And again, it goes back to a powerful hurricane also being large and fast moving. And so, large hurricanes do not weaken as quickly as they move inland. And especially when they're moving fast, those winds held together for a long, long time, well inland. And so, especially in communities that have trees, we've got to, in the future, when we see tropical storm watch or warning, in addition to hurricane watch or warning, we got to be thinking shelter like for a tornado in those tropical storm conditions, because a lot of the deaths occurred where trees came down onto homes. And that is a really grim reminder of how hurricane winds are not just a coastal event.
Yeah, absolutely. We saw a lot of that, especially up here. It's just not the trees being snapped because of the wet ground. We saw whole trees, root ball and all, come over, and these are old growth trees, obviously, crushing homes and vehicles, and there were a lot of fatalities because of that. Let me ask you a general question, because last year and this year for hurricane season, we've seen some interesting things, these lulls in activity. We had one last year right before Helene, and then it got really active. We're seeing a similar lull this year, and now things are starting to perk back up. What do you attribute these weird lulls in the middle of the season the last 2 years?
Now, last year was notable, and this year was unprecedented in the active era since 1995 to have from late August to mid September to have no named storms at all. And that, despite the fact we have these warmer than average sea surface temperatures throughout the Atlantic basin. I mean, we have known for a long time that there are ups and downs within the hurricane season. The global tropics in the atmosphere have conducive conditions and then less conducive conditions move around, mostly from west to east. And so even within a busy hurricane season, you can have a week or two that gets quiet and then it ramps back up again. The reason last year and this year are so notable is that they happened back to back and spanned essentially the peak activity period of the hurricane season. Now, on some level, we understand what's going on, but on another level, this would be a couple of great PhD dissertation studies to figure out if there's something new going on to cause the peak of the season to have a lull. Now, I would guess that next year or over the next few years, we're going to have some peaks of the season that live up to their reputation, and we will not see this be a long-term trend. If that does become a long-term trend, boy, does that merit some study. However, Brad, on the other hand, when it comes to impacts, and for everyday folks like you and me and everybody listening to us right now, when the hurricane hits is of secondary importance to being ready for whenever a hurricane hits. So it is scientifically interesting, and it has spared us from landfall threats during some of the busiest time of the year. But as we saw last year, and in many recent years, Brad, we've had a lot of late loaded seasons. In fact, in the last 10 years, we've had far more major hurricanes in the Atlantic basin after mid-September than before. So even if we are getting lulls in the peak of the seasons are staying stronger and longer lasting. So the break in the middle of the season does not mean we can't have late September, October, even November devastating landfalls.
Yeah, and that's such a great point, because obviously we still got a long ways to go, and folks are definitely got to pay attention because we're not out of the woods yet. Dr. Nab, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you for chiming in, and we'll be tracking these other systems out here over the coming weeks as we remember Helene this week, but we still got a long ways to go in the hurricane season.
Yes, Brad, thank you so much for having me. And we do have a long way to go. And I hope in future events like Helene, maybe we can make some strides toward proactively evacuating people from inland areas when we see a high risk of flooding in a mountainous area. Maybe we can do inland what we do for people near the coast for storm surge someday.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Nab. Julia, we'll go back to you. We're going to be here live this evening for our shows on air and online as well in Fleetwood as we continue to track 1 year since Helene. Julie, back to you.